All right. Hello, I am Savannah Haverson. I'm the Community Relations Representative here at University House Issaquah. And before we start today's presentation, I'd like to share just a little bit about our beautiful community. University House Issaquah is a premier retirement community located near the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, where our residents enjoy access to nearby Issaquah shopping centers, as well as beautiful views of the Issaquah Alps and the year-round natural beauty of our 2 courtyard gardens. We are honored to be partnered with the University of Washington Retirement Association, which gives our community a distinct academic flair and as well as access to UWRA programs. Our residents share a passion for knowledge, art, and culture, and a desire to remain active in mind, body, and spirit. If you'd like to learn more, please give us a call at 425-557-4200. And now on to our main event. We are honored to host Cassandra Sutherland and Bob Free, who will be presenting on Death with Dignity. Cassandra Sutherland is a client services manager at End of Life Washington. She earned her master's in global public health from the University of Washington. In her role with End of Life Washington, she works with clients, providers, and volunteers. Bob Free has served on the End of Life Washington Advisory Committee for many years before joining the board of directors. Bob and other lawyers from his firm generously provided many pro bono hours, authoring 7 amicus briefs and on behalf of survivors of former End of Life Washington clients. He is now the board president of End of Life Washington. And I will now turn it over to Bob.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. As Savannah said, I am a lawyer and I'm retired now and I only have 1 case left that I'm working on. But I am very involved in End of Life Washington, but I'm bringing not my legal perspective to this as much as generally what things could help you and help others at the end of their lives. And so the fact that I'm a lawyer is not that important at this presentation. So to start, you probably don't know much about End of Life Washington, and I'll tell you a little bit about it in case it's new to you. We provide 3 main sources of work to people in the state of Washington. We're particular to serve people in the state of Washington. All of our services are free. We don't charge. It's mainly run by volunteers like myself. Cassandra is a staff person. We have 8 staff, but mainly volunteers. And we have actually over 100 volunteers that do substantial work for the organization. The 3 parts are education and resources, like we're doing today, presentations that we do throughout the state. To people, sometimes to hospices. We educate physicians about end-of-life practice. We have resources that people can access information, and our website is particularly good. You can find almost everything you need to know about end-of-life choices on that website, and we encourage you to visit it. The support we provide to people is done mainly by our volunteers. Casa is the coordinator of the volunteers. And Casa, why don't you explain a little bit who the volunteer client advisors are?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. So we have about 70 volunteer client advisors across the state. And these are folks who volunteer their time. And when somebody is looking to access medical aid in dying or voluntary stopping eating and drinking, these are the folks that are going out and meeting with people in person and supporting them through the process, be it the steps of medical aid in dying up to when they take their medications if they choose to, or getting the support they need for voluntary stopping eating and drinking. And without the volunteers, we really truly couldn't do this work. They are the heart and soul of the organization.
And then the third section that we do is advocacy and public policy. We have actually 7 lawyers that are volunteers, including myself, that talk about what kind of bills we should be sponsoring, how we can change the law. We are the organization that drafted the initiative in 2008 that established death with dignity in the state of Washington. Oregon was first. We were the second state to do that. We actually tried to do it first in 1991 and the initiative failed. But in 2008, it passed by close to 60% of the vote of the population, and it was put in effect in 2009. So we've had that law now for 13 years. We're getting more and more people interested in both the death with dignity law and the voluntarily stop eating and drinking, or VSED. And so we're trying to keep up with the number of people that want help and support, but so far we've been able to do a good job of doing that. We do have one bill that we've had in the legislature this last session. Unfortunately, it didn't pass, but we're going to introduce it again. It's called House Bill 1141. It was a bill to amend the Death with Dignity Act. Even though we wrote the initiative that made it the law, we realized there are some things in there that need to be changed, need to be updated. There are some barriers to people accessing death with dignity, like a 15-day waiting period. Only physicians can diagnose people as having less than 6 months to live. We want nurse practitioners and physician assistants be able to help with that, since they're often the people that are your primary caretaker. So we're going to be introducing that in the next session of the legislature in 2023, and we hope it'll pass at that point. We're very close to passing this last time. We also are going to be putting in at some point a bill to amend the Natural Death Act to allow what I'm going to talk about later, which is something called My Instructions for Oral Feeding and Drinking, which comes into play for people that have Alzheimer's or serious dementia. And we're trying to make that a legal document as part of the Natural Death Act. So next slide. So I'm dividing this into two parts. One is talking about the Death with Dignity law, and then the second part will be the overview of the second part that we're engaged in, which is the voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. Okay, next slide. The most important thing that we tell people when they're learning about end of life is that they have choices, and you always have a choice. Sometimes you don't realize that, and you have a choice to accept or refuse treatment. It may seem obvious, but a lot of people think, well, the doctor is going to make the decisions about what happens to me. And as long as you're competent, you can make those decisions yourself. You can say, I want to stop treatment. I want to not have my heart resuscitated if I have a heart attack. I don't want to take antibiotics if I have a UTI. I don't want any further chemo or radiation if I have serious cancer. So you always have a choice to do that. And that's one thing we want to make sure people know. Next slide. There are ways to improve the end of life that you have with either palliative care. This can be at any stage of the disease. You can do this same time as you have curative treatment, and it's covered by most insurance, and it can be done at a home or facility. This is care to reduce the pain and stress, often involves taking morphine or another serious pain medication, and it can also be to end your psychological relief, where you're not so upset or anxious about the possibility of dying. And of course, you all know about hospice. This is something where you have to have a diagnosis of 6 months or less to live, to be able to be eligible for hospice, and your doctor will make that diagnosis for you. And you cannot do the curative treatment if you're under hospice care. It's recognizing that you are in the last stage of your life. It is paid for by Medicaid and Medicare and insurance, and we work closely with hospices around the state to try and educate them about the end of life choices you have when you are in hospice. And these choices, death with dignity and voluntarily stop eating and drinking, can be done as part of hospice. Casa, you work closely with hospices. Do you want to add anything about hospice care?
I would say, I mean, just in general, we know that people tend to get into hospice later than they need to. Like the average hospice stay is about 2 days to 2 weeks, when their service really should be to help you through those last 6 months. They offer incredible resources, and you can always say what you want and don't want. Just because they come with a lot of options doesn't mean you have to say yes to everything. And so I always encourage people that wraparound support that hospice brings to you and to the people around you can make such a difference in the last months of your life. And I can't recommend it more, truly.
Okay, next slide. So let's move on to now hastening death, dying on your own terms. These are things that you have the legal right to do in the state of Washington. You can choose the timing of your death, if you don't want to just wait for the very, very end that will come naturally, you do have a right to hasten your death. And the first one we're going to talk about is death with dignity, or medical aid in dying. It's allowing someone to control the timing of their death with medication to reduce anxiety, pain, and or suffering. And Casa tells people about timing of death with the pregnancy story. Casa, do you want to explain that?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. So when we talk about hastening death and timing of death, it's difficult to talk about. And for some people, it makes them uncomfortable. And I always like to frame it as birth and death are our 2 guarantees in life, and everything else is something in between. And when somebody is pregnant, we know that birth is expected. We've done planning and prep around it. And in our current system, somebody might control the timing of that birth. They may be induced, they may have a cesarean, but that birth is happening. It's just a matter of when it happens. And the same thing applies to dying and medical aid in dying. We know that death is happening. It's an expected death. We know it's coming. And medical aid in dying just allows people to control the timing of that, similar to how you would control the timing of that in a pregnancy. So it's really not much different. And that tends to help people kind of conceptualize it in that parallel fashion. Back to you, Bob.
90% of the people that choose death with dignity or medical aid in dying are clients of End of Life Washington. Some will do it independently with their doctor and family supporting them, but most of the people do it with our help. And I really recommend that, because we have these volunteer client advisors that will help you through the process. They'll explain the process to you or family members if they maybe want to know more about the process. They will help you with some of the paperwork that's involved, and there is paperwork. They'll explain the waiting period and help you through that so that the timing is just like you want. And so it's very helpful to have a volunteer client advisor work with you. We find that a large number of the people want death with dignity, not only because of pain, but because of the fact that they want more autonomy. They want to be able to control what's happening in their life. They don't want to be taken care of totally by someone else. They want to be able to live their life to the very end, but with dignity and with independence. Some people will have a celebration at the end of life before they have the death with dignity medication, to go out in a celebratory way. People will enjoy the fact that they can say goodbye to their people, all of their family members, if they're planning the timing of their death. And 25% of the people that request death with dignity and get the medication don't end up using it, because the very fact that they have the medication makes them feel like they have control and that they can limit their anxiety, and they die a natural death anyway. And so there is a real good way of going through this, even if you don't know for sure you're going to actually take the medication. It gives real peace of mind. So more things about the terminology that's used in here, and I'm going to let Casa explain some of these terms.
I think this is really important because we know words matter. Medical aid in dying is not euthanasia. Euthanasia is something that's legal in our neighbors of the north, like in Canada, or across the big pond, like in Europe, where the doctor can actually help facilitate somebody's hastened death by administering the medication themselves. Our law is very clear that a person has to self-ingest these medications. And it's also really important that this is not assisted suicide. Medical aid in dying is different than suicide. The person who's choosing medical aid in dying is living with a terminal diagnosis, and a person choosing suicide often is wanting to die without a terminal diagnosis. Something else I like to talk about in terms of terminology is we passed our law and it's called the Death with Dignity Act. And we said, come learn about death with dignity. But the real preferred kind of terminology we use for it is medical aid in dying. And the reason for that is death with dignity. There are many ways to die with dignity. You can die with dignity on hospice, not using medical aid in dying, of a natural death, of many different ways. And so, I just want to put that out there that, using medical aid in dying is a dignified death, but it's not the only way to have a dignified death.
Let's talk a little bit now about actually what our law says in the state of Washington that was adopted by the initiative in 2008 and went into effect in 2009, as I said. So the qualifications to be eligible for having your doctor prescribe the medication to you to end your life is that you, as I said, have a terminal illness with less than 6 months to live, and that you're a resident of the Washington state. That residency is fairly easy to establish in Washington, and we've had people move here from different states in order to be able to exercise the right of our law. And so somebody in Idaho can do this by moving here, and as soon as they say this is their permanent resident, they are a resident of the state of Washington and can have their doctor, who has to be a Washington state doctor, licensed in Washington, to prescribe the medication. They have to be 18 years of age or older. And we have had a client that was 18 that actually used the law. And they have to be capable of self-administering. In Canada, you can have your doctor give you an injection. In the United States, in the state of Washington, you have to be capable of self-administering it yourself, which means you have to be able to take the mixture that's mixed up for the medication and swallow it. Or if you're on a feeding tube, you have to be able to push a button so that the feeding tube is activated so that it will go into your system. And you have to be the one to make the real decision and the final decision that you're going to go ahead with this. It does require 2 doctors who will support you. One is the attending physician, who is the person that would be writing the prescription. And that's the one that you start the process with by saying orally to them, to your doctor, I want to do this. I want to do death with dignity or medical aid in dying. And then there is another physician that comes in who is the consulting physician, who backs up the decision of the first doctor that you really are terminally ill with less than 6 months of to live, that you are capable of self-administering, and most importantly, that you have decision-making capacity, that you know what you're doing and you understand the choice that you're making. It doesn't mean that you can't, you might be starting down the dementia road that many of us as we get older do. Doesn't mean that you can't make that decision rationally. And so it doesn't require 100% on top of the world kind of decision making, just that you really understand what you're doing and that the doctors then will support you in this by saying yes. If they have questions about your mental state or whether you're doing this because you have an unusual depression or you have some psychological issues, the law does require them to refer you to a psychologist or a psychiatrist to help you evaluate, and also to advise the doctors, yes, this person is they're upset, because anybody would be perhaps if they're dying, but that they're not seriously depressed and they do have decision-making capacity. Okay, so some other considerations about death with dignity. I'll let Casa explain this kind of complex chart, because there are some requirements to make sure that this is done properly and that people know what they're doing. Casa, do you want to explain how death with dignity works?
Yeah, and the number one thing I want you to take away from this chart is get this started early if you think you might want this as an option. So if you think you want medical aid in dying, when you start hearing those conversations with your physician about prognosis or hospice care, that's when ideally you can start this medical aid in dying death with dignity process. Because it does take a lot of different steps, and it takes at the minimum 15 days, which is a barrier for a lot of people. A lot of people come to us too late to actually make it through the whole process and the waiting periods. And what's also important here is our volunteers are trained to walk alongside you in this process so that you don't have to navigate the details or what comes first or second. They do that for you, and they just tell you what your next step is. But like Bob said earlier, it starts with a first oral request to your physician. It must be an MD or a DO. It couldn't be a nurse practitioner or a physician's assistant. And that's an oral request basically stating, I want access to medical aid in dying. I want you to write it in my chart that I'm interested in pursuing Washington State's death with dignity law, or something to that effect. You also need 2 physicians to support you. Both those physicians will review your medical records and make sure you qualify for the law and sign off. After you've seen both physicians, then you do a written request, which is witnessed by 2 people. Basically, you're signing saying you've been well informed about all parts of this process and know what you're signing up for. And then after that written request, you can do a second oral request on day 15. And that's when the medications can be written and sent to the pharmacy. It has to be a compounding pharmacy, and there's only about 17 right now in the state. And the medications cost around $700 to $800, and they're good for 6 months. And it comes in a powder that you mix with liquid, and you drink it in about 2 ounces of liquid is how it is dispensed.
So you can see this is a fairly complex process, and that's why having a volunteer client advisor work with you can help you get through this, because we're talking about the end of your life, and these are fairly complex steps to go through. We're realizing now that since there has not been a complaint throughout the United States about any of the 10 states that have the death with dignity laws, that it's been abused somehow, that somebody's been forced to do this, or that someone who is not cognizant of what they were doing used this, or they were pressured to do it by family members. There has not been one complaint that it's been abused in any of the 10 states that have it. And so some of these safeguards that were put into the initiative in 2008 really are probably not totally necessary anymore. And we're hoping to simplify this process with a bill in the legislature. And other states are doing that. California just amended their law to have a 48-hour waiting period rather than the 15 days that we have. Oregon amended the law to say that if a patient is likely to die before the 15 days, then the physician doesn't have to wait the whole time, and the patient doesn't have to wait the whole time before they get the prescription. We do find that, let's talk a little bit more about death with dignity considerations. Next slide, is that people, 40 to 50%, even more, we're finding, don't live long enough till the end of the 15-day waiting period. And that's why it's so important, as Casa said, to start it early. And that we find also that 7 out of the 10 people that come to our offices for help need help in finding a physician. Their physician works for a religiously controlled hospital that says you cannot, none of our people, none of our doctors can do death with dignity and participate in the law, or they don't have a consulting physician to help them. So far, we've been able to hook everybody up that comes to us with a doctor that will help. We have volunteer physicians, usually they're retired, but they're still licensed and practicing to help people through this process. And we do need more practitioners to assist us, because as this law becomes more usable and used by people, we need more physicians to help. As I said, 25% of the people don't end up using the medication, but it's still very important for peace of mind. And you see on the right-hand side of the screen there, the different people that have used it, ages, and the different kind of diseases they've had. And so it is eligible for all kinds of people that have different problems and different issues to use the law. Okay, let's see if there's anything else there. Okay, next slide. So the Death with Dignity Act says that this is not suicide. It's part of the statute. And so insurance policies would still come into effect if there had been a prohibition of suicide. Death with dignity or medical aid in dying is not suicide. It doesn't affect your wills or other contracts. And importantly, the cause of death listed on the death certificate is the underlying disease, the cancer, or the heart problems, not death with dignity or suicide for sure. Next slide. So I want to tell you about a person that did decide to use the death with dignity law. Her name is Christine Fong, and she's been willing to go public with this. She's here with her 2 daughters, and she's a beautiful example of how end-of-life choice can make important decisions for people. She was diagnosed with bone cancer in 2004, and she had a battery of radiation treatment that left her really drained and lifeless for almost a year. But her cancer went into remission, but she never forgot the anguish and the mental and physical side effects of the treatment. So when cancer came back 12 years later, it was very aggressive, and she decided she wanted to use the death with dignity law in the state of Washington. She told her family, "This is what I want." And with the support of her family and end-of-life Washington, we found 2 physicians to help her. She persevered, and she planned her final days, and she was surrounded by the people she loved at the time she took the medication, and she was granted her wish to die without suffering. So, as I said, it's a chance to say goodbye, to build in a ceremony, to be able to die at home as opposed to in a hospital. And so her story is, I think, a beautiful story. Next slide. Now, excuse me, medical aid in dying, of course, is not available to everyone. If they don't have the 6-month diagnosis, there are people that might have beginnings of Alzheimer's or dementia. And so the other option is something called VSED, voluntarily stop eating and drinking. It's a choice that allows them to end their suffering and take control of their death, very similar to the death with dignity. And this is particularly important for people that have issues with dementia or a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. It's a voluntary choice, to hasten death by removing nutrition and hydration. It takes about 1 to 2 weeks to go through the process. It has to be voluntary, so this has to be the choice that you are making, and you can stop it at any time. You don't have to go through with it if you decide it's too uncomfortable to do so, and people can't deny you food if you're requesting it. But what we find is it does take people who have pretty strong wills and strong self-determination to go through it. And it requires vigilant collaboration with your caretakers and hopefully with hospice support and with a doctor. You would want a doctor to help you prescribe anxiety medication if you got anxious during the process, to control pain that might be part of the process. Actually, the pain would not come from the VSED. It would be coming from maybe a disease you had. It's considered a painless way to die, and it's a natural way of dying. People have done this for centuries. That they at the end of life, they become less interested in food. They stop eating and drinking, and their death is hastened that way. It hasn't been widely talked about before, and it isn't something that has been recognized in the medical community until just recently. And we're finding that more and more people are interested in VSED once they know about it. There's a growing awareness, and we're finding more and more people. It used to be 1 or 2 a year would come to us and use VSED. Now it's, many more people are choosing this as an option. And you don't have to be terminal at the beginning of the process, as I said, but at some point during the process, you are going to be terminal. And that's why you could be admitted to a hospice. Many hospices, not every single one, but many hospices would allow you to complete VSED in the hospice. So you would be able to get a doctor to support you in that process. CASA knows a lot about this and has spoken about it, and has actually helped people in the process. So CASA, why don't you say some more things about VSED?
Okay. I actually came to this work because my father was diagnosed with early stage dementia and really didn't want to live through the process of the disease. And so we were looking for other options, and he chose voluntary stopping eating and drinking. It's really important that you have medical collaboration and an entire care team around you, and that you've really thought out this process and planned for it. It's really not something you just do at the flip of a coin. It takes collaboration and support. It really is most commonly used right now for people who aren't qualifying for medical aid in dying, and really for dementia and early Alzheimer's is where we're seeing a lot of cases of VSED is the only legal option for people in these situations. For some people, it's the least bad choice. Maybe it's not their first choice, but it's the least bad. And I always say in the case of dementia that you're giving up some good days for bad years. And I say that because you have to not miss your window of opportunity when it comes to dementia to do this. You have to have the capacity to know what VSED is and to continue to make that choice. And so you might be giving up a few good days for bad years is where that comes from. The other thing I noticed that Hank put a question in here about dementia, and I think this is a good place to just mention this, is we use the acronym VSED, but it's referring to voluntary stopping eating and drinking, which means that VSED in the case of dementia is really being used in the early to middle stages of somebody's dementia prognosis. There's also something else that I think is really important, that if you think you might have to get dementia or have just been diagnosed with an early stage of dementia, it is signing a stopping eating and drinking directive. And we have some of these available at End of Life Washington's website. But basically, this is a directive that you file away with all of your advanced directives that your healthcare agent knows that you have on file and you've talked to them about it. And it basically allows you to say, at a certain point in my disease of dementia, so when I'm in my late stages of dementia and no longer show interest in food and water, I want you to not force feed me. I do not want you to spoon feed me. You get to decide how you want to be given food or water. Maybe you just want comfort food, so foods that you show interest in. But that is really important for people who maybe VSED isn't what they want to do, but they could do a stop eating and drinking directive to prepare to those middle to late stages of dementia. And I recommend, even for people who are thinking of both as an option, that if you think dementia is coming your way, or if you do have an early prognosis, that you look over a stop eating and drinking directive. They're relatively new, and they are an important part of your kind of care packet and advanced directive plans.
Okay, let me tell you about, let's back up about Jeff first, the person that used VSED. He's the man in this picture here. In February of 2015, he was diagnosed with progressive supranuclear palsy, a disease that caused significant pain and severe problems with walking, sight, and swallowing. And he was 64 years old when he was diagnosed with this. And he reached out to End of Life Washington to understand what his options might be when the disease became too overwhelming to manage. And so he couldn't qualify for death with dignity because he would have more than 6 months to live if he didn't take some action. But he could choose voluntarily stop eating and drinking when his pain became unmanageable and his quality of life had diminished too much. So in the winter of 2017, 2 years after the diagnosis, he found that he had reached that point. His disease was uncompromising. He was suffering. And so on April 13th, with the support of caregivers, families, and friends in 2017, he began his choice to stop eating and drinking. He never complained. He never changed his mind. He had ample support. He was kept comfortable during the process, and he was on a path to die well. And that's exactly what happened. His hospice caregiving team said it was one of the most beautiful deaths that they had experienced. But there is, okay, we can move on now to the next slides. There is another story about that I wanted to tell you. We're going to skip Jean's story, and I'm going to tell you about my sister's story. We don't have a picture of her here, but this was in 2018. My sister, who is 7 years older than I am, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. She never really understood that she had a serious problem. She resisted the fact that she should have a memory care unit that she moved into, that she resisted the fact that why her family was putting her there was very painful to go through that process. And I feel somewhat negligent because I was not confrontive of her and talking to her about what her real situation was as much as I should have been. But it was very difficult to get her to understand, even when I tried that. And I was searching for a way that I could help her. And I did find that, as Casa said, that at the end stage of life, people lose the interest to eat and drink. And I talked with my niece, who was the healthcare agent for my sister, and she talked with the facility where she lived. This was in Oregon, and they were very willing to stop forcing Janice to eat, to stop even pushing food on her, to stop putting food in front of her, and also the same with drink. And so she, I think, died much sooner than she would have otherwise because of this. We also decided that when she had a urinary tract infection that she would not be treated for that. We treatment for pain, but not for the actual curing of that. And so I think she died much sooner than she would have otherwise, because sometimes people live, 15 to years and longer in these memory care units where they basically lose all function and all capabilities, as I'm sure you know, with people with Alzheimer's particularly. And so what I did at that point was I came back to End of Life Washington and talked with a couple of other people and said, we need to create my instructions for oral feeding and drinking so that people can sign this in advance when they're totally cognizant or when they're just beginning to have dementia. And it's a document that says, when I reach this stage where I am not interested in food, don't force me. Don't push the food on me like many places do. They feel it's their obligation to keep eating and drinking. Take this dietary supplement so you'll be more hungry. You can say, don't do that if I don't show an interest in it. Just do comfort feeding only. If I really seem to want hunger, don't starve me to death if I want food, but don't force it on me. And many people are starting to sign this, and it's been adopted in other places. Other states of other organizations are starting to use this also. So it's something definitely to consider. And as Casa said, you can get it from our website. So this is end of life options with dementia. At the beginning stage, you're going to, of course, want an advanced directive. And we do have something called the Dementia Directive. It's also on our website. It's a separate document that helps you instruct what you want to have happen if you have Alzheimer's or serious dementia. Do you want to live at home? Do you want to be in a memory care unit? Do you want to have this person take care of you or that person take care of you? Another document is the PULST document, which you probably know about. It's the green form that your doctor has to sign, and that can be signed by a nurse practitioner too, by the way. And you sign it too, or your healthcare agent signs it if you're not capable of signing. And that is one that's basically in an emergency situation where you have a heart attack or a stroke and something's very serious, whether it gives instructions about how you want to be treated. And the other part is voluntarily stop eating and drinking. We've had several people that use this, that they know that serious dementia or Alzheimer's is coming, and they make the choice early on to do this. If you wait too long, of course, you're not going to have the willpower or the cognition to go through the process of VSID. And so when you get to the severe stage, many of these things come into effect also, but then that's when my instructions for oral feeding and drinking can come into effect to aid you with that dementia process. Okay, next slide. So now's the time when we'll have some questions, and hopefully there's some in the chat. And if not, if you haven't had a chance to put it in the chat, we'll have the screen sharing there, and either Daniela or Savannah can recognize you, and you can ask the question to Casa or me. So are there any in the chat, Daniela, that you want to read first?
Not yet, but we also encourage folks to unmute themselves if you're comfortable with that and just ask your question.
Yeah, wave your hand if you want and unmute yourself and ask the question.
Archie, go ahead.
Hi. Thanks, Danielle. Let's go back to one of the earlier points that Bob made. $700 to $800 for the medications. Does that get covered by insurance, and what are the medications?
The medication is a compound of different medications, and some insurance will cover it, some won't. Medicaid, unfortunately, does not cover it, and Medicare doesn't cover it either. So, Casa, do you want to talk more about the medication?
We do. So for people who really don't have any resources to cover that cost of the medication, there is a foundation, a nonprofit that works with, you can apply to, that will cover the cost. If you have, like Bob said, unfortunately, our federal insurances don't cover it. But if you have, it's always great to submit the cost of the medication to insurance, because our hope is that they will start to cover it, and sometimes they do. The medication is a compounded medication of 5 ingredients. It is five. Yep. It is digoxin, diazepam, morphine, amitriptyline, and phenobarbital. And those 5 medications work to put somebody asleep. 2 of the ingredients are basically really strong doses of Valium and morphine. And so a person who takes these medications falls asleep in about 5 to 15 minutes and stays deeply asleep as their body shuts down. And then 2 of the medications work to stop the heart and the lungs, which is how the medications work.
We used to use phenobarbital, but found that it was getting way too expensive and difficult to access. And so our organization actually created this compound medication that's used throughout the United States and the other 9 states that have this law. And it's been tinkered with over time to provide the most peaceful death possible and fairly soon death, rapid. That answer your questions?
Yes, it did. And one of the concerns was we hear a lot about how the unfortunate folks who were put to death by legal systems because of crime or other issues did not die comfortably, had agonal issues at the end, and those get carried around publicly a lot in terms of the concern. But in this case, those 5 medications and the order in which they're given lead to a virtual certainty of comfortable death.
People don't wake up, they don't regurgitate. It's a peaceful death.
I will also say one of the differences with our federal penal system and our medical aid in dying is that it is not being ingested for them. In medical aid in dying, people are ingesting it themselves, which helps secure that the process will work.
Okay, thank you. That was very helpful. I also want to go back to something Bob said earlier, and then I think was somewhat confused. He mentioned that a primary physician would be the first physician to provide the prescription or to agree with Death with Dignity medical aid in dying. But then later it turns out that you can find any 2 physicians. So I wanted to make sure that for those whose primary care physician may not be in accordance with this, and that certainly can happen, you can help. Well, you can help, but can't they find 2 other physicians on their own?
Exactly. Yes. And or we help people find the physicians for them. If their doctor says, I don't want to do this, or I'm working for a religiously restrictive hospital, we'll find the physician, or you can find your own. It doesn't have to be your primary care.
Okay, good.
And unfortunately, a lot of doctors say, there is some paperwork involved in this. They have to report the death and give information to the Department of Health after the death. And they say, oh, I don't want to do this. But, talk to your doctor and encourage them. You're my doctor. I want you to help me through this. Talk to them about it. And I think they should be helping you if that's something that you want.
Okay,
Thank you
for that.
Any other questions? I see some hands waving around.
Yes,
Bobby,
Yes, I have a question. First, a comment. My screen says Bobby Jensen, but that's not my name. My name is Dave Green.
Okay.
So if you are taking attendance. Also, I wondered, I have a 2-part question. Do you do these in-person presentations at other CCRCs and how are you funded?
Okay, well, there are a few more slides at the end, but I'll jump ahead without the slides. That we do like to do these presentations anywhere that people ask for them, and we're willing to do them in person now that COVID is hopefully on the wane. And we're funded totally by donations, we don't receive any federal or state monies. And it's just, it's people that want to donate to us. And so we do have a place on our website where you can do that. If you Google End of Life Washington, you'll get our website, and that will help you with the donations. You had another question? Second part?
Yeah. We,
No, no, I think you answered both. You
Okay,
do you do the in-person presentations if asked, and you also are self-funded and by donations.
right. That's right.
That's all my questions. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
I did see a question in the chat that I just want to answer real quick from Rick, asking, are the 5 medications compounded as a standard dose or adjusted for individuals, particularly those already taking some of those medications? That actually is a standard dose. It doesn't get adjusted either way. We have said that the dosage of the dose of these medications is enough to take down an elephant or the whole string section of a quartet. It is quite a hefty dose, and so they don't need to be adjusted. It is a kind of one size fits all. We don't ever say how long the process of dying will take for people. That really depends on the nature of your disease, other health factors. It usually is anywhere between 5 minutes and 24 hours is the range I give. It always works, and most, 80% of people die within 2 hours. So it really is usually around an hour to 90 minutes, but it could be a long range depending on what disease you may have or other things that could impact it. But the dose stays the same.
Anybody else have a question?
Yeah, we've got a few minutes left, Bob, so I'll add a couple questions. A
Okay.
comment, though, it's unfortunate that Medicare and Medicaid don't cover the medications, because this is unfair to those who are unable to purchase $800 worth of medications. And the bigger problem in the country, in fact, is that lower socioeconomic group with dementia who need help in dying, and now they can't afford to do it. So who's working on the Medicare, Medicaid government coverage problem?
Well, unfortunately, it was part of the Affordable Care Act that says that no federal monies can be used to support death with dignity or medical aid in dying.
But that was 2010.
right, right,
So
right. No, we hope that it could be changed, but it's still a process. When we get to have more than 10 states, if it's maybe 25 out of the 50 states have a law, hopefully Congress at that time will realize this is going to be recognized throughout the United States. But right now, it's still a very controversial issue for a lot of people. The Catholic Church still takes a really strong position against this. The Washington Medical Association takes a position against medical aid in dying. And so we think now I would guess now most physicians in the state of Washington would not most, but a majority would support the law. But at the beginning of all of this, most physicians did not support the law. They felt that this conflicted with their duty to take care of people. And so that to be involved in helping someone die was against their code of ethics.
okay, thanks. Go ahead.
I'd just like to add there that I hope, Archie, that you may take this up and that all of us collectively can take it up a bit. I do want to say that nobody's been prohibited from accessing medical aid in dying in the state of Washington who can't afford it. Thanks to our organization and another, we make sure that regardless of your socioeconomic status, that you have access. That's really important to us. And we don't charge for our services. That is also really important to us. But I really want to say what scares me more is how we are losing secular healthcare in the state of Washington. And through mergers, about 50% of our healthcare now is controlled by restrictive institutions. And what that means is that they prohibit their providers from participating in medical aid in dying. And so that means people will go to their providers and say, hey, I want this as an option. And they'll say, sorry, I can't help you. And what that means for us as an organization is that about 7 out of 10 people who come to us need help finding either both physicians or at least one of their physicians. They've gone to their PCP, to their specialists, to their palliative care doctors, and everyone's prohibited from participating. And so they're relying on a group of volunteer physicians in Washington to make this accessible. And that to me is actually even scarier because it's a legal option that people don't know they have and can't access when they want to.
It's wonderful to have these answers. Thank you both. From an economic point of view, we spend probably, I'm just going to throw out $1 trillion to help those at the end of life, to maintain them in our hospices for much longer than they need to be. So economically, it would make sense for the entire country to do this. Another quick technical question. If I have somebody who's outside those 9 or 10 states and wants to take advantage of a state, can they go to Washington and within days be qualified, or do they have to become a resident?
You can become a resident the day you moved into the state of Washington. There's no residency requirement of how many days you have to live here. And your doctor is going to make that decision about whether you are a resident. So if you move here, you're living at your son's house, and that you're saying, this is my residence now, then you are a resident of the state of Washington. To be safe, you'd want to do some things like maybe get a voter registration card or a driver's license to back it up. But the doctor's going to be the one to decide. If you're a resident, then they will treat you. And so people do that, and we're happy to work with them if they are doing that.
Last question, which I think is more general. Let's say that I want to sign a directive to allow me to either take advantage of voluntary stopping of eating and drinking, or of what you described as my instructions for oral feeding and drinking, called SED, or comfort feeding only. Can I do that with an attorney? Do I have to have it countersigned, witnessed, documented? What would be the process to have that done as a directive?
Well, you either need 2 witnesses or have it notarized, but you do not need an attorney for any of these things. The advance directive or even the healthcare power of attorney, those are forms that you can fill out yourself and have proper witnessing or notarizing. You don't have to go to a lawyer. My fellow attorneys would not want me to say that, but that's true.
No, I'm sure some of them would. All right, so Daniela or Casa, can you provide those forms to those who are attending this conference? And the VSED and the SED and the CPD?
I want to clarify the VSED part. The voluntary stopping eating and drinking, because it has to be a voluntary choice, will you have capacity still? It is something you can put in your directive, but there's not a specific VSED directive to sign until you're actually, a few weeks away or months away from starting VSED, and then you'll sign like a declaration of your intention to do VSED. It is helpful to put in your advanced directives maybe an addendum saying, I'm really interested in doing VSED if and when the time comes that I have a dementia diagnosis and those type of things. Stopping the oral feeding and drinking, those are something that you'd want witnessed and signed that you would do tomorrow if you wanted to. But there's not necessarily a specific VSED directive that you have to fill out.
Yeah, and really quickly, I will follow up with Tina with an email that contains links to all of those documents so that she can forward it to everybody, hopefully not only the people that attended the presentation, right? So that you don't have to go poking around the website necessarily to find a lot of these resources.
Okay, please keep doing this. The question that I've forgotten, he changed his name from what was on the screen, asked about it. You're not being compensated, but keep doing is more important than your fellow attorneys who are being. Okay, keep going. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
You will. Okay, any other questions before we stop? It's at the noon hour now. Okay, well, if you have further questions, you can call End of Life Washington. We have a person on the phone that will either take your call or call you back soon, and we'll try to answer your questions or find someone that can help you or put you in touch with a volunteer that will work with you through this whole process. So we encourage you to use our resources. So thank you very much for attending. Enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Bob and Casa and Daniela. We really appreciate you taking the time to present today. We will be sending out this additional information that will be provided along with a feedback survey. We'd love to hear any comments, additional questions that you might have, and we'll be sure to pass those along to Bob and Casa. If you are wanting to learn more about our community here at University House Issaquah, please give us a call. Our phone number is 425-557-4200. Again, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, and thank you all for attending. And we hope to see you at one of our next events.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.